The gate they buried became the evidence that buried them the morning they sealed my cabin gate. Melissa Grant stood there smiling beside police cars and concrete trucks like she'd finally won. By lunchtime, my gate was trapped in concrete. My ranch was supposedly under control, and half the neighborhood was celebrating. The only problem? Nobody bothered to check who actually owned the only road connecting 63 homes to the outside world. What started as another HOA power play turned into something nobody saw coming. Not Melissa, not the board, not even the deputies standing there watching it happen. And when a dusty box of old ranch records finally revealed the truth, the entire neighborhood realized they had been cheering for the wrong side. If you enjoy stories where patience beats arrogance and facts beat power, take a second to subscribe. Now let me show you how one concrete barrier became the biggest mistake an HOA president ever made. The morning they sealed my gate was the morning they thought they had finally beaten me. I was halfway up the gravel road to my cabin when I saw flashing lights through the pines. At first, I figured there had been an accident. Ridge Creek Estates sat between my ranch and the state highway, and every now and then somebody would slide a truck into a ditch or back into a mailbox. But as I rounded the bend, the smell hit me before the scene fully came into view. Wet concrete, fresh diesel exhaust, construction equipment. I slowed my pickup and stared. 3 cement trucks blocked the entrance to my property. Workers in reflective vests moved around my iron gate with practiced efficiency. Steel forms had already been set around both gate posts. Gray concrete flowed from a chute into the trenches like a river of stone. For a few seconds, I honestly thought they were at the wrong address. Then I saw Melissa Grant. She stood near the shoulder of the road, holding a clipboard and a travel mug, dressed like she was attending a ribbon-cutting ceremony instead of trespassing on private property. And standing beside her were 2 sheriff's deputies. My stomach tightened. I parked, stepped out, and walked toward the gate. "What exactly is going on here?" I asked. Melissa turned with a smile that looked rehearsed. "Good morning, Ethan." The workers kept pouring. Nobody stopped. Nobody even looked at me. I pointed toward the concrete. "That's my gate." Melissa nodded. "Temporary security improvements." I actually laughed. Security improvements. Ridge Creek Estates has received multiple complaints regarding access concerns. The HOA board authorized corrective action. I looked from her to the deputies. One of them shifted uncomfortably. The other avoided eye contact. "Corrective action on my property?" I asked. Melissa's smile never moved. The board determined this was necessary. Necessary. The word hung in the air. That gate had stood there for more than 30 years. My father had installed it with his own hands. After he died, I maintained it. After my wife passed away, that drive became one of the few places that still felt like home. And now strangers were burying it in concrete, while the HOA president watched. I stepped closer to the nearest worker. "Do you have permits for this?" Before he could answer, Melissa spoke. "Please don't interfere with the crew." One deputy finally cleared his throat. "Mr. Walker, we're only here to keep the peace." "The peace?" I said. "They're sealing my gate. We've been told there's an ongoing property dispute." "There isn't." Melissa folded her arms. "There is now." A few residents from Ridge Creek Estates had gathered nearby. Some stood beside golf carts. Others watched from pickup trucks. Nobody said a word. Most of them looked uncomfortable. A few looked pleased. The concrete continued rising around the posts. Foot by foot. Inch by inch. Permanent. Melissa walked closer. "You could have avoided all of this." I met her eyes. And how exactly was I supposed to do that? By cooperating. There it was. The word she'd been using for months. Cooperate. Submit. obey. Whatever version fit the moment. I expected to feel angry. I expected to feel helpless. Instead, something else happened. I noticed where the trucks were parked. I noticed where the deputies had positioned their vehicles. I noticed what every resident behind Melissa seemed completely unaware of. The realization settled over me so suddenly I almost smiled. Melissa saw my expression. Her confidence faltered for the first time. "What?" she asked. I looked past her toward the long stretch of road disappearing through my ranch. The same road every homeowner in Ridge Creek Estates used every single day. The same road every school bus used, every delivery truck, every ambulance, every moving van, every visitor. All 63 households depended on that road, and every foot of it crossed my land. Melissa mistook my silence for surrender. "You should start thinking about your next move, Ethan." I nodded slowly. "Oh, I am." The workers finished the final section of concrete. The gate wasn't opening anytime soon. Melissa seemed satisfied. The deputies prepared to leave. The residents began drifting away. They thought the fight was over. They thought they had won. Standing there beside the gate my family had protected for decades, I watched them celebrate a victory they didn't understand. Because while everyone was focused on the gate they had sealed, nobody seemed to realize what they had just trapped. And it wasn't me. The question wasn't whether I could get through that gate. The real question was what would happen when the entire neighborhood discovered who actually controlled the only road connecting them to the outside world. That answer didn't begin on the morning Melissa sealed my gate. It started 6 months earlier, when she became president of the Ridge Creek Estates, HOA. Before Melissa Grant took over, the subdivision mostly left me alone. We weren't friends exactly, but we were neighbors. People waved when they passed my ranch. I'd help pull a truck out of a snowbank. They'd stop by my workshop when they needed a gate welded or a trailer repaired. Nobody cared that my property sat outside the HOA boundaries. Then Melissa arrived. Within weeks, everything changed. Her first visit came on a Saturday afternoon. I was replacing boards on an equipment shed when a white SUV rolled into my driveway. Melissa stepped out carrying a clipboard. Even then, she looked like she was inspecting a crime scene. "Mr. Walker?" I set down my hammer. "That's me." She glanced around the ranch, the barn, the corrals, my tractor parked near the fence, everything my family had built over 3 generations. "I'm conducting a community standards review." I laughed. "For what community?" Her smile tightened. "Properties adjacent to Ridge Creek Estates affect overall property values." There it was, the first hint. Not a request. Not a conversation. An assumption. She pointed toward my red barn. "The paint color is visually inconsistent with the surrounding neighborhood." I honestly thought she was joking. She wasn't. Over the next 10 minutes, she criticized my fencing, my workshop, my equipment storage, and even the cabin near the upper ridge. When she finally left, I figured that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, county inspectors arrived. Someone had reported unsafe agricultural structures. The complaint was anonymous. The inspectors found nothing. 3 weeks after that, another complaint. This time involving environmental violations. Again, nothing. Then came accusations about abandoned vehicles, improper drainage, unauthorized construction. Every complaint ended the same way. No violation, no citation, no problem. But the message was obvious. Melissa wasn't trying to win. She was trying to wear me down. At first I ignored it. After my wife Claire died 3 years earlier, I'd learned there were battles worth fighting and battles worth avoiding. Most evenings I worked in the shop until dark. The smell of cedar and machine oil filled the air. The work kept my hands busy. The silence helped keep the grief manageable. But Melissa wasn't interested in peace. She wanted control. And every time reality refused to cooperate, she escalated. One evening, she cornered me outside the mailbox cluster near the subdivision entrance. Several residents stood nearby. Melissa loved audiences. "Ethan," she announced loudly, "the HOA board is discussing improvements to the community access corridor." I already knew what that meant. The road. The single paved road connecting Ridge Creek Estates to Highway 84. Every homeowner used it. School buses used it. Delivery trucks used it. Everyone treated it like HOA property. Melissa, especially. "We'll probably be updating maintenance authority soon," she said. I looked at her. "Maintenance authority?" She nodded confidently. "The board needs more direct control over the road." A few residents agreed. Others simply listened. I asked a simple question. "Who told you the HOA owns that road?" Melissa actually laughed. "Everyone knows the HOA owns the road." The confidence in her voice caught my attention. Not because she was right, because she was completely certain. That certainty bothered me. A lot. That night I drove the entire length of the road, from the subdivision entrance all the way to the highway. Every curve, every shoulder, every drainage ditch. The same route I'd known since childhood. My grandfather had supervised much of the original grading work decades earlier. As I passed the old property markers near the South Ridge, something surfaced from memory. A conversation. A warning. Something my grandfather used to say whenever developers came around asking questions. I couldn't remember the exact words, only the feeling. The road mattered, more than most people realized. Back at the ranch, I pulled an old county map from a filing cabinet. Then another, and another. Midnight came and went. The deeper I looked, the more questions I had. By sunrise, one thing was clear. Melissa Grant had built her entire campaign around an assumption. And assumptions can be expensive, especially when they're written over someone else's property line. The next morning, I made a decision. It was time to find out exactly what my grandfather had left behind. And somewhere inside an old metal document chest gathering dust in my workshop, I had a feeling the answer was waiting. The chest sat beneath an old workbench covered with decades of ranch records, repair manuals, and survey notes. My grandfather had never thrown away a piece of paper if it involved land. According to him, fences could rot, buildings could burn, and politicians could lie, but documents had a way of surviving long enough to tell the truth. I spent 2 nights sorting through the contents: tax records, livestock permits, old correspondence, hand-drawn maps. Nothing that immediately answered my questions about the road. Meanwhile, Melissa kept escalating. The next county complaint arrived on a Thursday morning. This one claimed I was operating commercial machinery without proper permits. Deputy Cole Harrison was standing beside the county inspector when they pulled into my ranch. The inspector looked embarrassed before he even stepped out of the truck. "Sorry, Ethan," he said. "We have to follow up." "Let me guess," I replied. "Anonymous complaint." He nodded. 40 minutes later, they left with the same conclusion as every previous inspection. No violation. No citation. No case. As Deputy Harrison climbed into his cruiser, he paused. "You've been getting a lot of these lately. Funny how that started right after Melissa became HOA president." He didn't answer directly, but he didn't disagree either. That afternoon, I drove into town for supplies. The change in how people treated me was becoming impossible to ignore. 2 homeowners from Ridge Creek Estates spotted me at the hardware store and immediately lowered their voices. Another couple who used to wave every week suddenly found something fascinating on a shelf across the aisle. Melissa's rumors were working. She wasn't just attacking my property. She was attacking my reputation. A few days later, I discovered just how far she'd gone. I stopped at the diner near Highway 84 for breakfast. The waitress, Linda, had known me for years. As she refilled my coffee, she hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." She lowered her voice. "Are you really threatening people over that road?" I stared at her. "What?" She looked uncomfortable. "Some folks from the subdivision said you're trying to force everyone out." I almost laughed. Instead, I felt something colder. Melissa wasn't merely filing complaints anymore. She was building a story. And in her version, I was the villain, the isolated rancher, the angry widower, the difficult neighbor, the man standing in the way of progress. That evening, I installed a filing cabinet beside my workbench. Every complaint, every inspection report, every interaction, every letter. Everything went into a growing collection of evidence. If Melissa wanted to create a record, I was going to make sure there was a complete one. 3 weeks later, she showed up in person. Again. This time, she wasn't alone. 2 HOA board members stood beside her near my gate. One of them was Rebecca Sloan. Unlike Melissa, Rebecca looked uncomfortable. Melissa carried another clipboard. Of course she did. "We need to discuss community concerns." I stayed where I was. "No, you need to discuss community concerns." Her smile tightened. "Residents are worried." "About what?" "Your attitude." I couldn't help it. I laughed. For a moment, Melissa looked genuinely offended. "We're trying to improve the neighborhood." I glanced around the ranch. The fences were maintained. The fields were clean. The buildings were solid. Everything was exactly where it belonged. "Funny," I said. "The neighborhood wasn't worried until you arrived." Rebecca looked down. Melissa's face hardened. "You should be careful, Ethan." There was a warning hidden inside those words. Not a legal warning. A personal one. When they finally drove away, I stood by the gate watching dust settle behind their SUV. Then I went back into the workshop. Back to the document chest. Back to the records. Hours later, just after midnight, I reached the very bottom. Beneath stacks of surveys and aging property files sat a sealed envelope. My grandfather's handwriting covered the front. 3 words. Road access file. For the first time since this fight began, my pulse quickened, because whatever was inside that envelope, my grandfather had wanted it preserved. And suddenly, I wasn't wondering whether Melissa was wrong. I was wondering exactly how wrong she was. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside were folded survey maps, correspondence between attorneys, county filings, and a document that immediately caught my attention. The date. 1 year before my grandfather finished expanding the ranch. I spread everything across the workbench and started reading. By sunrise, I knew 2 things. First, my grandfather had anticipated future development long before Ridge Creek Estates existed. Second, he never trusted developers. Several handwritten notes were attached to the files. Most were simple reminders. Verify boundaries. Retain ownership. Never grant access without written agreement. The wording appeared again and again, almost obsessively. That afternoon, I called the one person who could help me make sense of it. Tom Reynolds. If there was anyone in Montana who knew property boundaries better than county records, it was Tom. He had spent 30 years surveying land throughout the region. When I told him what I found, he drove out the same day. The moment he saw the documents, his expression changed. He stopped talking, which was unusual for Tom. We spent 3 hours comparing maps, survey markers, historical plats, county records. By evening, Tom leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "Ethan." "What?" "You need to see something." He pointed to a faded survey drawing. A thick red line ran along the road connecting Ridge Creek Estates to Highway 84, the road everyone used, the road Melissa kept calling HOA property. Tom tapped the page. This road was never transferred. I stared at him. What do you mean never transferred? I mean exactly that. He slid another document toward me. The legal description was clear. The roadway corridor remained part of the Walker Ranch property. No county dedication. No municipal transfer. No recorded conveyance. Nothing. For several seconds, I just looked at the paper. After months of complaints and harassment, the answer was sitting right there. Melissa's entire campaign rested on a false assumption. Tom continued reviewing the records. The deeper we dug, the more incredible the situation became. The original developers had negotiated temporary construction access decades earlier while building the first subdivision entrance. Temporary, not permanent. The agreement expired years ago. Apparently nobody ever followed up. The developers sold the project. New owners took over. Then new HOA boards. Eventually everyone simply assumed the road belonged to the community. Nobody checked. Nobody verified. Nobody bothered reading the documents. Until now. Tom finally folded his arms. Legally speaking, every foot of that road is still yours. The words settled heavily in the room. Outside, I could hear trucks using the very road we were discussing, residents returning home from work, school traffic, delivery drivers, everyone crossing my property without realizing it. I wasn't interested in causing problems. I never had been. But Melissa had spent months treating me like an obstacle on land she didn't own. Now I knew the truth. The question was what to do with it. The answer arrived sooner than expected. 3 days later, I received another letter from the HOA. Mandatory appearance requested. Community compliance review. Failure to cooperate may result in further action. I laughed when I read it. The confidence in that letter was almost impressive. Melissa was threatening a man whose property rights she didn't even understand. That evening, I attended the meeting. For the first time. The community center was packed. Melissa stood at the front of the room with a projector screen displaying photographs of my ranch, my fences, my barn, my gate, like evidence in a criminal trial. When she saw me walk in, her smile widened. I appreciate you finally deciding to participate. I took a seat near the back. Just curious what authority you think you're exercising. A few people exchanged glances. Melissa ignored the question. For the next 20 minutes, she lectured homeowners about community standards, property values, and neighborhood appearance. Then she turned toward me. Mr. Walker continues refusing reasonable cooperation. The room became quiet. Everyone waited. Melissa expected an argument. She expected resistance. Instead, I stood up. Melissa. Yes? Who owns the road connecting this subdivision to the highway? Her answer came instantly. The HOA. The confidence in her voice was absolute, certain, unshakable, and completely wrong. I nodded slowly. Then I sat back down. Nothing more. No argument. No correction. No explanation. Melissa looked confused. Several residents looked confused too. The meeting continued. But something had changed. For the first time, I wasn't defending myself. I wasn't reacting. I wasn't trying to survive Melissa's attacks. I had evidence. I had documents. And I had the truth. The only question left was whether I should reveal it now, or wait until Melissa made a mistake big enough that nobody could ignore it. I decided to do neither. Instead, I gave her a chance. A real one. The following week, I scheduled a meeting with Daniel Pierce. Daniel had spent most of his career handling property disputes across Montana. By the time I laid the maps, surveys, and historical records across his conference table, he was already nodding. "Let me guess," he said. "The HOA thinks they own something they don't." More or less. 2 hours later, Daniel reached the same conclusion Tom had. The road belonged to the ranch. The HOA had no recorded easement, no transfer agreement, no ownership interest. Nothing. Legally, the situation was remarkably simple. Emotionally, it was about to become complicated. "What's your goal?" Daniel asked. I thought about that for a moment. 6 months earlier, I probably would have said peace. Now, I still wanted peace. I just wasn't willing to surrender for it. "I want a solution," I said, "not a war." Daniel smiled. "Then let's give them one." 3 days later, he sent a formal proposal to Ridge Creek Estates. The terms were almost absurdly reasonable. A permanent legal easement, $1 per year, shared maintenance standards, clear boundaries protecting both sides, no lawsuits, no penalties, no retroactive claims, just a clean legal agreement that solved everything. When I read the final draft, I couldn't imagine anyone rejecting it. Then again, I wasn't Melissa Grant. The HOA board meeting took place the following Tuesday. Daniel attended. I didn't. There was no reason to. The proposal spoke for itself. That evening, my phone rang. Daniel didn't sound surprised. They rejected it. I leaned back in my chair. That was fast. Melissa barely let the board read it. That got my attention. "What happened?" Daniel sighed. She called it an intimidation tactic. Of course she did. According to several people who attended the meeting, Melissa stood in front of the room holding the easement proposal, like evidence in a criminal trial. She told residents I was attempting to extort the neighborhood. She claimed I was manufacturing ownership disputes to gain control over the community. She even suggested the documents themselves might be inaccurate. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so reckless. The documents came from county records. The surveys were official. The legal descriptions were recorded decades before Melissa ever arrived in Montana. Facts didn't seem to matter. Not anymore. What mattered was winning, and Melissa had become obsessed with it. 2 days later, another letter arrived. This one was different. The language was more aggressive. The HOA demanded compliance with future roadway improvements. They requested unrestricted access to portions of my property. They warned of possible enforcement measures. There was just one problem. They had no authority to demand any of it. I called Daniel. "You seeing a pattern?" "I am," he said. "What do you think happens next?" There was a pause. Then he answered, "People who ignore legal reality usually escalate." That prediction proved accurate almost immediately. Within days, contractors began appearing near the subdivision entrance. Survey flags showed up along sections of the road. Residents started discussing future improvements approved by the HOA. Melissa openly talked about exercising community authority over the corridor. The corridor. A word she used repeatedly. A word that conveniently avoided saying what it really was. My land. Meanwhile, something else was happening. For the first time, a few homeowners started asking questions. Not many. Just enough. One afternoon, Rebecca Sloan knocked on my door. She looked uncomfortable, the same way she'd looked during Melissa's visit months earlier. "I wanted to ask you something." "Go ahead." She held up a copy of the easement proposal. Was this real? Every word. She studied my face. "Why only $1? Because I wasn't trying to profit. Because I wasn't trying to trap anyone. Because the entire fight could have ended peacefully." But I simply answered, "Because neighbors shouldn't need a lawsuit to use a road." Rebecca looked away. That seemed to bother her more than any legal document. As she walked back toward her truck, I had the feeling she was beginning to realize something. Melissa wasn't protecting the community. She was creating a disaster. The following Friday, Daniel called again. This time his voice carried a warning. "Ethan." "What now?" "The HOA scheduled an emergency board session." "For what?" "I don't know yet." The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Then Daniel said something I couldn't stop thinking about. If they're rejecting solutions this aggressively, they're probably planning action. I looked out toward the ranch gate, toward the road, toward the subdivision beyond it. Melissa had laughed at peace. She'd rejected the easiest deal she'd ever receive. And for the first time since this started, I began wondering not whether she'd make a mistake, but how big it was going to be. I got my answer 10 days later. The call came from Tom Reynolds at 6:12 on a Saturday morning. "Ethan, you need to get down to the gate." I was already pulling on my boots. "What's happening?" "Bring your phone. Bring copies of those surveys if you've got them." Then he hung up. That was enough to tell me it was serious. 20 minutes later, I turned onto the ranch road and saw exactly what Melissa had done. Concrete trucks, contractors, HOA board members, several sheriff's vehicles, and Melissa Grant standing in the middle of it all like a general preparing for battle. Workers were already setting forms around my gateposts. Fresh concrete poured into trenches on both sides of the entrance. Steel reinforcement bars disappeared beneath gray slurry. The project wasn't accidental. It wasn't temporary. It was planned. I parked and walked toward the crowd. Melissa spotted me immediately. A smile spread across her face, the same smile she always wore when she thought she was winning. "Good morning, Ethan. What are you doing?" "Improving community safety." I looked at the contractors, then paused at the concrete, then back at her. "On my property?" The HOA voted unanimously. I almost laughed. The confidence was unbelievable. The road, the gate, the entrance, everything she was touching belonged to land she didn't own, and she still thought a board vote changed reality. Deputy Cole Harrison stepped forward. Unlike the others, he looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Walker, we're here to keep the peace." "The peace?" I pointed toward the gate. "They're pouring concrete around my gate." Melissa folded her arms. "Your gate has become an obstacle." "No," I said calmly. "Your ego has." A few contractors exchanged nervous looks. The workers clearly understood something the HOA didn't. Property disputes made people nervous, especially when someone starts pouring concrete before checking ownership. I took photographs, lots of them. The trucks, the workers, the forms, the equipment. Melissa herself directing the operation. Every detail, every angle, every timestamp. Daniel Pierce had taught me something important. Evidence always ages well. While I documented everything, Melissa continued giving instructions. The gate slowly disappeared behind concrete barriers. By mid-morning, the entrance had narrowed dramatically. A full-size pickup could barely squeeze through. Then reality began arriving. The first school bus showed up. The driver stopped, stared, then climbed out. Children pressed against the windows trying to understand why the road looked different. The driver spent 10 minutes maneuvering around the new barriers. Traffic backed up immediately. Melissa ignored it. A delivery truck arrived next. Same problem. Then a propane company. Then a utility contractor. Every vehicle experienced delays. Every driver complained. Every complaint bounced directly into Melissa's lap, and still she refused to stop. Around noon, the first siren appeared. An ambulance, not responding to an emergency in the subdivision, just passing through on a routine transfer route. But even that crew struggled. The driver slowed to a crawl before squeezing between the barriers. The look on his face said everything. This wasn't safer. It was dangerous. Deputy Harrison noticed, too. I saw him speaking quietly with another officer. Both kept looking toward the concrete, toward the narrowing entrance, toward Melissa. The confidence she wore all morning began showing small cracks. Then came the moment everything changed. A moving truck approached from the subdivision, one of the larger rental trucks. The driver stopped completely. There wasn't enough clearance. Residents gathered. Arguments started. Horns sounded. People climbed out of vehicles. Suddenly, the entrance looked less like an improvement project and more like a bottleneck. A very expensive bottleneck. Melissa tried reassuring everyone. Temporary inconvenience, necessary upgrades, community safety. Nobody seemed convinced, especially the people stuck behind the truck. I stood quietly near my pickup, watching, recording, documenting, because the truth was becoming visible all by itself. Melissa thought she had trapped me. She thought sealing my gate would force me to surrender. What she hadn't realized was that every vehicle entering or leaving Ridge Creek Estates depended on the same narrow access point she had just obstructed, the same access point crossing my ranch, the same access point protected by documents she never bothered to read. As another line of vehicles formed behind the moving truck, Tom walked over and stopped beside me. "Looks crowded." I nodded. "Getting worse." Tom watched the traffic for a moment. Then he glanced at the barriers. "You think she realizes what she's done?" I looked at Melissa standing in the middle of the chaos she created. No. And that was the problem. Because the longer she believed she was in control, the bigger the consequences were about to become. The concrete barriers remained exactly where Melissa wanted them. Monday came. Then Tuesday. Then Wednesday. Instead of removing them, the HOA doubled down. Melissa sent a community email describing the project as a temporary safety improvement approved by the board. According to her message, the inconvenience was minor, and residents should remain patient while the HOA finalized long-term access enhancements. Nobody sounded patient. By Wednesday morning, traffic backed up every day at the entrance. School buses arrived late. Delivery companies began refusing oversized shipments. Several contractors canceled scheduled work because they couldn't safely maneuver equipment through the narrowed corridor. For the first time, homeowners started asking questions publicly. Not about me, about Melissa. The complaints began appearing in HOA meetings, then on community message boards, then in group emails. Each day brought more frustration. Each day brought more pressure. And each day Melissa responded the same way. She blamed me. According to her version of events, the barriers existed because I refused to cooperate with the HOA. The logic didn't make sense. More and more residents were beginning to realize it. One evening, Rebecca Sloan called me directly. That surprised me. She'd never contacted me outside official HOA business. "Ethan, do you have a minute?" "Of course." Her voice sounded tired. "Melissa says you're threatening legal action." "I haven't filed anything." A long silence followed. That's what I thought. I could hear papers moving on her desk. People are getting worried. About the road? About money. Now we were getting closer to the real issue. Most homeowners didn't care about property law. They cared about consequences. And consequences were finally starting to appear. The next morning, Daniel Pierce arrived at my ranch carrying a banker box full of documents. He set everything on my kitchen table. I found something. That immediately got my attention. Daniel wasn't the type to build suspense. If he said something mattered, it mattered. "What is it?" He opened a folder and slid a contract toward me. The document was older than the subdivision itself. Original development paperwork, signed decades ago, buried deep inside county archives. The kind of record most people never bother reading. Daniel pointed to a highlighted section. "Read this." I did. Then I read it again. The language was surprisingly clear. Any party obstructing access through the designated ranch corridor could become financially responsible for resulting damages, delays, emergency access issues, and associated costs. The wording wasn't vague. It wasn't symbolic. It was enforceable. My eyes moved back to Daniel. "You're serious?" "Completely." He handed me additional documents, legal opinions, recorded amendments, supporting filings, everything connected back to the same conclusion. The original developers knew access through the ranch was critical. They knew blocking it could create major problems, so they built protections directly into the agreement. Melissa had never seen any of it. Neither had the HOA. Until now. "How bad is this?" I asked. Daniel leaned back. "Worse than they realize." He began listing possibilities. Delayed commercial deliveries, emergency response issues, property damage claims, contractual penalties, liability exposure. The more he talked, the more obvious the situation became. The barriers weren't just inconvenient. They were potentially expensive. Very expensive. That evening, another problem surfaced. A fire department vehicle responding to a medical call inside Ridge Creek Estates reported delays navigating the narrowed entrance. No injuries occurred. No emergency was lost. But the incident generated paperwork. Official paperwork. The kind that tends to survive lawsuits. By Friday, rumors were spreading faster than Melissa could control them. Residents wanted answers. Board members wanted explanations. And Rebecca Sloan was asking increasingly uncomfortable questions during HOA meetings. Questions Melissa couldn't answer. Questions about permits. Questions about liability. Questions about ownership. For the first time since becoming HOA president, Melissa wasn't directing the conversation. She was defending herself. The shift was subtle, but it was happening. Late Friday afternoon, Rebecca showed up at my ranch. No clipboard, no HOA documents, no accusations, just questions. We stood near the fence line overlooking the road. Traffic continued flowing through the same corridor everyone suddenly cared about. "Did Melissa know?" Rebecca asked. "Know what?" "That the road wasn't HOA property." I thought carefully before answering. "I don't know what Melissa knew." Rebecca stared toward the entrance. "But she should have checked." That was the first honest thing I'd heard from the HOA in months. She should have checked. The entire disaster existed because nobody checked. Nobody verified. Nobody read the documents. They assumed. And now those assumptions were becoming expensive. As Rebecca drove away, Daniel called again. His tone carried the same urgency as before. "I found another file." "What kind of file?" "One you're going to want to see immediately." "What is it?" There was a brief pause. Then Daniel answered. "It's the original penalty schedule attached to the development agreement." I looked toward the road, toward the barriers, toward the subdivision beyond them. And for the first time since Melissa poured concrete around my gate, I started wondering not how this would end, but whether the HOA could afford the ending that was coming. The answer arrived the following Monday. Daniel Pierce spread a stack of documents across my kitchen table. At the top sat the original development agreement. Beneath it was the attachment he had mentioned. The penalty schedule. The document was only 3 pages long. It didn't need to be longer. The language was direct. Any party responsible for obstructing access through the designated ranch corridor could be held liable for resulting damages, delays, emergency response interference, and associated legal costs. I read every line carefully. Then I looked at Daniel. Melissa has never seen this. No. The board hasn't either. No. What happens when they do? Daniel closed the folder. That depends. On what? Whether they're smart enough to stop digging. Unfortunately for everyone involved, Melissa Grant had never confused confidence with caution. By Wednesday, she called an emergency HOA meeting. The notice went to every homeowner in Ridge Creek Estates. Community concerns regarding ongoing access disputes. Mandatory attendance encouraged. The wording sounded official. The tone sounded confident. But the timing told a different story. Residents were angry. Questions were multiplying. The pressure inside the neighborhood had reached a level Melissa could no longer control through emails and rumors. For the first time, she needed a public explanation. Daniel suggested we attend. I agreed. The community center filled quickly. Homeowners occupied nearly every chair. Some arrived carrying copies of HOA emails. Others carried photographs of the concrete barriers. The atmosphere felt different than previous meetings. Less loyal, more suspicious. Melissa stood at the front of the room. Her posture remained confident, but the cracks were becoming visible. She started with a familiar speech. Community safety, property values, responsible governance. The same phrases she'd repeated for months. Only this time, people weren't nodding. They were listening critically. When she finished, hands immediately went up. The first question came from a homeowner named Brian. Who approved the concrete barriers? The board. Did the board verify ownership before construction? Melissa hesitated. Just for a second. Then she moved on. The next question came from another resident. What happens if the HOA loses this dispute? Melissa dismissed the concern. We're not losing anything. The room didn't seem convinced. Then Rebecca Sloan stood. The shift was immediate. People trusted Rebecca. She had lived there for years. She wasn't dramatic. She wasn't political. And she wasn't known for creating conflict. I have a question, she said. Melissa nodded cautiously. Rebecca held up a document, a copy of the easement proposal Daniel had sent weeks earlier. Why did we reject this? The room became quiet. Melissa looked irritated. It was an unreasonable demand. Rebecca shook her head. It was $1. Nobody spoke. Melissa's expression hardened. The issue wasn't the amount. Then what was the issue? For the first time all evening, Melissa didn't have an immediate answer. That silence mattered. People noticed it. I certainly did. Then Daniel stood. Not dramatically, not aggressively, calmly, professionally. Exactly the way attorneys deliver bad news. He carried a binder to the front table. Inside were maps, deeds, survey reports, county filings, recorded agreements, facts, nothing more, nothing less. For nearly 30 minutes, he walked the room through the documents. One step at a time. The road, the ownership history, the development records, the absence of any permanent easement, the original surveys, the recorded property descriptions. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. Because every statement came with paperwork. Every claim came with evidence. Every fact came with documentation. As Daniel continued, the energy in the room changed. Homeowners stopped looking at me. They started looking at Melissa. Then Daniel revealed the final document. The penalty schedule. You could almost feel the room tighten. He explained the original agreement, the corridor protections, the financial exposure, the potential liability resulting from obstructed access. Nobody needed legal training to understand the implications. Money. Lots of money. Potentially HOA money. Potentially homeowner money. The realization spread row by row. Melissa attempted to interrupt. Daniel simply handed copies to the board, including Rebecca, including several residents, including Melissa herself. For the first time since this conflict began, Melissa was forced to confront documents she couldn't dismiss. She flipped through the pages, then flipped back, then forward again, searching for something, a loophole, an error, anything. She didn't find it. The room had become completely silent. No whispers, no side conversations, no interruptions, just dozens of homeowners processing the same realization simultaneously. Their HOA president might have created a disaster she had repeatedly ignored opportunities to avoid. Rebecca finally spoke. Her voice was barely above a normal conversation. Melissa looked up. Did you know about any of this? The question hung in the air. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Everyone waited. Because regardless of her answer, the room had already changed. The real authority in the building no longer belonged to the person holding the gavel. It belonged to the documents sitting on the table. And judging by the expressions around the room, the homeowners were about to decide whether they still wanted Melissa leading them into whatever came next. Melissa looked down at the papers, then back at the crowd, then at Rebecca. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, Melissa straightened her shoulders. The HOA's legal position remains unchanged. The statement landed badly. Very badly. Not because people disagreed, because it ignored everything they had just seen. The maps, the deeds, the surveys, the development records, the penalty schedule. The room had spent 30 minutes watching facts dismantle assumptions. Melissa responded with a slogan. A homeowner near the back stood up. So who pays if this goes wrong? Another voice joined in. What happens if we're liable? Then another. And why weren't we told about the easement offer? Questions began arriving faster than answers. Melissa tried regaining control. She reminded residents about property values, community standards, neighborhood unity. Nobody seemed interested. The conversation had moved beyond appearances. Now it was about consequences. Real ones. Financial ones. Daniel waited until the room settled. Then he stood again. I believe everyone deserves clarity. That got everyone's attention immediately. He distributed another set of documents. Formal legal notices. Prepared but not yet filed. Several board members read them silently. The color drained from their faces. Rebecca's eyes widened. One homeowner whispered something under his breath. Another leaned forward to reread the first page. The notices outlined 3 separate issues. Property interference. Damage to private improvements. Potential contractual liability resulting from obstructed access. None of it sounded dramatic. That was the frightening part. The language was calm, professional, certain. And certainty carries weight when supported by evidence. Melissa grabbed one of the notices. This is intimidation. No, Daniel replied. This is documentation. The room became quiet again, a different kind of quiet. Not confusion. Recognition. The recognition that reality had finally arrived. Rebecca stood. For the first time in months, she wasn't asking questions. She was making statements. The board never reviewed these records. Nobody argued. We never saw the ownership documents. Again, nobody argued. We rejected a legal solution before understanding the facts. Several residents nodded. One of the other board members lowered his head. Another simply stared at the table. The unity Melissa once controlled was gone, completely gone. The next blow arrived 2 days later. A special HOA meeting was called. Attendance was overwhelming. Word had spread quickly throughout Ridge Creek Estates. People wanted answers. More importantly, they wanted protection. The board opened the meeting by reviewing financial exposure. The numbers weren't catastrophic, yet, but they were large enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Legal costs, potential claims, repair expenses, possible penalties. The room became increasingly tense as each figure appeared on the screen. Then someone asked the question nobody could avoid. How did this happen? Every eye turned toward Melissa. For the first time since becoming HOA president, she looked genuinely alone. No applause, no supporters, no confident nods, just silence. The same silence she'd spent months creating for everyone else. Now it belonged to her. 3 board members publicly broke ranks that evening. Rebecca led the effort. A motion was introduced demanding immediate negotiations with Daniel and me. Another called for removal of the barriers. A third requested an independent review of board decisions related to the dispute. Melissa opposed all 3. She lost all 3 votes. The margins weren't even close. After the meeting, homeowners gathered in small groups throughout the parking lot. Nobody talked about me. Nobody talked about the ranch. Nobody talked about the gate. They talked about trust and how badly it had been broken. The barriers finally came down the following week. Concrete sections were cut apart and removed. Contractors spent 2 full days restoring the entrance. I watched most of the work from my truck, not because I enjoyed it, because I wanted a record. Every repair, every invoice, every correction. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same gate Melissa tried to use as a symbol of authority had become the strongest piece of evidence against her. Every photograph from the construction day, every witness statement, every contractor record, every meeting minute. All pointed to one simple fact. The gate had never been the problem. The abuse of authority was. Late Friday afternoon, Rebecca stopped by the ranch. She looked exhausted, but relieved. Melissa's finished. I wasn't surprised. What happens now? The board requested her resignation. And? Rebecca gave a small smile. She refused. I nodded. That sounded like Melissa. What happens if she keeps refusing? Rebecca looked toward the road running through the ranch, the same road that started everything. The homeowner's vote. As she drove away, I stood beside the gate my father built, the gate Melissa buried in concrete, the gate that ended up exposing everything. The road beyond it looked exactly the same as it always had. But legally, emotionally, and politically, everything had changed. For the first time since this fight began, Ridge Creek Estates understood a simple truth. The road had never belonged to them, and now everyone was waiting to see whether Melissa would accept responsibility or make one final mistake that would cost her everything. She made the mistake. 3 days after the homeowners demanded her resignation, Melissa sent a community-wide email blaming everyone except herself. The board, the residents, the contractors, the county. Me. According to Melissa, the entire dispute had been manufactured by people who refused to support her leadership. The message spread through Ridge Creek Estates in less than an hour. By sunset, homeowners were forwarding copies to one another. Instead of saving her position, the email accomplished the opposite. It convinced even her remaining supporters that she wasn't going to take responsibility for anything. The vote happened the following week. Attendance broke every HOA record. Homeowners packed the community center. Some stood along the walls. Others listened from the hallway. Nobody came to discuss landscaping, fences, or neighborhood rules. They came to decide whether Melissa Grant should remain HOA president. The result wasn't close. Her removal passed by a landslide. When the final count was announced, the room remained strangely quiet. No cheering, no celebration, just relief. Months of conflict had exhausted everyone. People wanted solutions. Not another fight. Rebecca Sloan was elected interim president that same evening. Her first motion was simple: resume negotiations with Ethan Walker. Her second motion passed immediately afterward: require independent legal review before any future board action involving private property. The era of assumptions was over. The era of documentation had begun. A week later, Daniel Pierce and I sat across from Rebecca and the newly reorganized board. The atmosphere couldn't have been more different from previous meetings. Nobody made threats. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody pretended ownership documents didn't exist. For the first time, everyone worked from the same set of facts. The agreement took less than 2 hours. The HOA received a lawful permanent easement. The ranch retained ownership of the corridor. Maintenance responsibilities were clearly defined. Property boundaries were formally recognized. Everything Melissa could have secured months earlier for $1 and a signature. The HOA also agreed to cover the costs associated with the gate damage, legal expenses, and restoration work connected to the barrier project. It wasn't a crushing judgment. It wasn't revenge. It was accountability. Exactly what should have happened from the beginning. The final paperwork was signed 32 days after the barriers came down. When Daniel handed me the completed documents, he smiled. Not many cases end this cleanly. I looked at the signatures, the legal descriptions, the recorded easement language. The road that caused so much conflict finally had clarity. That's because most people don't stop fighting. He nodded. Fair point. The changes inside Ridge Creek Estates happened gradually after that. Board meetings became public and properly documented. Financial decisions required greater transparency. Residents started paying attention to what was actually being approved. The community survived. In some ways, it became stronger. People who had spent months arguing finally started talking to one another again. As for Melissa, she quietly sold her home before the end of the year. I heard she moved out of state. I never saw her again. Honestly, I didn't need to. The outcome wasn't about defeating Melissa. It was about protecting something that mattered. Truth, ownership, responsibility. The things that exist, whether people acknowledge them or not. Several months later, I stood beside the same iron gate my father had built decades earlier. The concrete was gone. The damage had been repaired. The hinges swung smoothly again. Traffic moved normally along the road beyond it. School buses, delivery trucks, families heading home. Exactly as it should be. The sunset reflected across the ranch fields, while the distant sound of tires drifted through the valley. For a moment, I thought about Claire. One of the last conversations we ever had on the porch of the cabin. She told me something I didn't fully appreciate at the time. Power makes people feel important. Character shows who they really are when that power disappears. Melissa lost power. The community found perspective. And I learned that patience can accomplish things anger never will. I reached for the gate and pushed it open. Not because anyone forced me to. Not because I lost. Not because I won. Because neighbors deserve a road. And because respect works better than intimidation ever will. The gate stayed standing. The ranch stayed mine. The road finally had the legal protection it always should have had. And Ridge Creek Estates learned a lesson nobody there was likely to forget. When people ignore facts long enough, Reality eventually introduces itself, usually with paperwork.
If there's one lesson this story teaches, it's that standing your ground doesn't always mean fighting louder. Sometimes it means staying patient, keeping good record, knowing your rights, and letting the truth speak for itself. Ethan never won because he was stronger, richer, or more powerful than anyone else. He simply refused to abandon to facts. In the end, the document mastered more than the argument, and respect accomplished what razor never could. There's something comforting about that. In a world where people often rush to conclusion, the truth still has value. Property lies, arguments, promises, and responsibilities may not seem exciting, but they matter. And when people handle conflict with dignity instead of anger, communities have a chance to heal instead of falling apart. Now I'd love to hear from you. If you think it can handle the situation the right way, type 1 in the comments. If you would have taken a different approach, type 0. And if you ever deal with an HOA, a property dispute, or a neighbor who pushed things too far, feel free to share your story below. I read as many comments as I can, and some of your experiences are every bit as interesting as the story we tell here. And if you enjoy this story about perseverance, property rights, and ordinary people facing difficult situations with patience and common sense, consider subscribing. We'll be glad to have you with us for the next story. Until then, take care yourself and thanks for spending part of your day with us.